Hi, Misha here, and for regular Misha channel viewers, this is just kind of a fresh look, reassessment of the aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy from World War II. For those people that came over from the Mishaco channel for the extended version, thank you. And in the Mishaco channel, I really just looked at the major fleet carriers at Midway, Akagi, Kaga, and talked about how they met their end there. And in this one, we're going to look at 12 different carrier types. On the top row, we have what are essentially larger so-called fleet carriers. These are usually supporting 60 plus aircraft and weigh 20,000 tons to 30,000 tons or even greater. On the bottom row are light carriers or escort carriers. These can range from under 10,000 tons up to around 25,000 tons. Kind of just depends. And support a smaller air group. And many of them were part of the so-called shadow fleet, as they were not originally built as aircraft carriers, but they were designed from the beginning to be easily converted into them. Gets into the whole Washington Naval Treaty, London Treaty system, and the limitations placed on Japan. So kind of different things. And we're just going to talk about them, have some fun. Yeah, it's going to be a long video. Get some snacks, and we'll get into it. When the Japanese entered into World War II, they really had one of the most, perhaps the most advanced aircraft carrier fleet in the world. They operated 10 aircraft carriers, 4 definitely being fleet carriers, 2 kind of virgin fleet carrier, and then 4 smaller light or escort carriers. Now, the U.S. had 7 carriers, and Britain had 8. However, these were split between the Pacific and the Atlantic. For example, the U.S. only had 3 operational carriers in the Pacific, and Britain only had 1. Of course, this could easily change. The Panama Canal existed. But this meant that all of Japan's carriers were in the Pacific, and they had a doctrine of kind of lumping them together to support and strengthen each other. Now, one of the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty, Japan was only allowed a little over 80,000 tons for their carriers, whereas the U.S. and UK were allowed 135,000 tons, or almost. And the argument for it, aside from the U.S. and Britain just being more powerful, they had 2 oceans, 3 if you count the Indian Ocean too, to patrol, whereas a nation like Japan only had the Pacific, or Pacific and Indian if you want to do that. In reality, it really wasn't honest or fair. But that's kind of how treaties often work out. So Japan did what they could to kind of work around this. And they had some very interesting carriers and carrier doctrine at the time. And for about 6 months, they enjoyed great success. So we'll talk about things like the Battle of Midway, Leyte Gulf, the Philippines, and getting into 1945, at least for those carriers that made it. And we have to kind of begin with the beginning. And not only the first Japanese carrier, but in many ways the first true purpose-built carrier ever to be commissioned in the world. The Hosho, or Phoenix, a very historical ship for not only Japan, but the entire world. And it dates all the way back to 1918, in the end of the First World War, when the government authorized the construction of what was going to be at the time a seaplane tender. But then the British worked with HMS Argus, and the idea of an aircraft carrier was really coming to light. So it was decided to lay her down as a dedicated carrier. Now, technically, HMS Hermes was laid down first. Hosho here would start in December of 1920. But she would both launch in November of 1921 and be commissioned into the fleet in December of 1922, just over 2 years after being laid down. She would launch before Hermes, making her the first purpose-built carrier in the world. Of course, the U.S. would have the USS Langley, CV-1, and these were done for experimentation and trying to work out the whole idea of what it is. So, in 1923, they began trials with landing of aircraft and other things. In 24-25, she would go back to the shipyard for a little bit of retrofitting after the fact, when they kind of figured out what did and didn't work. For example, removing the superstructure, the mast, and changing things up a bit. And then she would be back in the fleet later on, along with the newly commissioned Akagi. Hosho here would be part of the fleet in 1928. Now, this is not a large vessel. It's just over 550 feet long, and it's just under 60 feet beam at the hull, and the flight deck is a little over 70 feet at its widest point. She had a crew of about 550, and her minimum weight was about 7,500 tons, and maximum weight was just shy of 9,500 tons. She had a maximum speed of 25 knots. Interestingly, originally they projected to have her at about 30 knots, but kind of looking at what the British were doing, what was and wasn't working for them, they intentionally slowed her down to about 25 knots for various logistical reasons. She was fitted with 5.5-inch guns, plus 3-inch guns for air defense, and she carried up to 15 aircraft, at least initially, 9 fighters, and up to 6 torpedo bombers. She had a hangar, 2 elevators, no catapults. The front of her flight deck was actually angled down to help with takeoffs. No, not really any armor to speak of. Again, pretty small, light vessel, but it's part of how the Japanese learned their fleet doctrine. But she did see combat, because she was one of the very few aircraft carriers in the world in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Operating alongside the new Kaga in 1932, Hosho would be there for the Shanghai incident in February, and her planes would engage the enemy fighter on fighter. Her bombers would also attack ground targets and work with aircraft from Kaga, and would fly several sorties throughout the month of February. After this, she would return home for some reworking, and they would improve her aircraft over time. And in 1935, she was caught out in the typhoon in what would become known as the Fourth Fleet Incident, and this required her to go in for repair between November and January of the next year. Like a lot of Japanese ships, she was top heavy, so they had to add weight where they could. They strengthened the front of her flight deck. They fixed her funnels in the horizontal position, and they would start to upgrade her air defense, as it was clear this would become important. Unfortunately, like a lot of Japanese ships, she ended up cursed with more and more of the not wonderful 25mm AA guns, but I digress. She would go back into the fleet in service and would be there for the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, working alongside Ryujo, another light carrier we're about to look at, and flying various missions. Afterwards, she would return home in 1939 and would be put in reserve for another minor refit. They would enlarge her elevators, and they would designate her as a training vessel. And as 1940 rolled around, they put the new, well, not new at this point, but the A5M Claude, new to Hosho, on board, and looked at the feasibility of putting the A6M0, another newer aircraft, on her, but just decided they couldn't. She was too small, too outdated, so the A5M would pretty much be the most advanced fighter Hosho would get. So she was a training vessel, support ship, and this would continue. Now, interestingly, in December of 1941, during Pearl Harbor, this was a support ship for the main fleet, not the aircraft carriers, but the battleships in the Pacific and the Japanese fleet. Her planes would fly scout missions, anti-submarine missions, and generally speaking, just reconnaissance and patrol missions, and she would help escort and guide the ships after the attack. And she would actually be put into the same position in May, moving into June of 1942 for the Battle of Midway. She again was a support ship for the battleships there, flying CAP, scout missions, patrol missions, anti-sub, and actually it was an aircraft from Hosho here that would, unfortunately for them, discover the burning hulk of Hiryu, and therefore they knew she was lost. After that, she would return to home waters and be designated as a training vessel yet again. And while she would move around throughout 1943 and 44, she was still used as a training ship. They again kind of looked at the feasibility of using her in front line. In fact, in March and April of 44, they enlarged her flight deck. They extended it 20 feet on each end, giving it a length of over 590 feet, which this model is from 1944. But while this let her take on board some more modern aircraft, the extra weight plus the new arrestor gear, the increased AA batteries, meant that she was exceedingly top-heavy, unstable, and she could not operate in anything but calm waters. So she was just too old. But of course, in 1944, they're getting a little desperate, so they thought they would just try. But she would continue to be a training ship throughout that year and her kind of final refit there. So that's the first years of Japan's and really the world's first aircraft carrier. Also, I should point out, because of newer, larger aircraft, by this point she only carries 10 or 11 instead of 15 as earlier. So not exactly a large air group. But that's kind of okay by 1944 because Japan's having a real hard time finding planes, and even more so, pilots to fly them. So they had more carriers than they did aircraft at this point, and that would only worsen as the war would drag on. We now come to the two, well, if not sisters, or even half-sister ships, step-sister ships perhaps, Akagi and Kaga. Akagi was first, but since this model of Kaga is in its original 1932 kind of triple-decker configuration, it's a better place to start because Akagi looked much like it did when first launched, and conversely, after refit, Kaga looked more like Akagi here. So, yeah, doing these slightly out of order, but I think you can understand why. Kaga started life as a Tosa-class battleship, laid down in 1920 and first launched at the end of 1921. However, 1922, Japan signed the Washington Naval Treaty, which put a lot of limitations on overall tonnage for battleships and carriers and what have you. But it did allow for the signatories to convert 2 battlecruiser hulls or 2 battleship hulls into carriers. So Japan selected Akagi and Amagi to be converted. These are still under construction, and they would be Japan's first fleet carriers. Now, its very first aircraft carrier was Hosho, which was coming into service around this time. But it was a small carrier, only carrying about 15 aircraft. But, you gotta start somewhere. So, yeah, Akagi and Amagi were to be the carriers, but in 1923 there was that great Kanto earthquake, which damaged Amagi's hull. Could it have been repaired? Maybe, but Kaga's hull was just there. So they decided that year to make it the new carrier, and so they scrapped Amagi. But it would take a while for work to begin because of the cleanups and everything else. So finishing her out really didn't begin until 1925, and she was officially commissioned to begin sea trials in 1928, and she would join the fleet fully in service at the end of 1929. Now this model here is from 1932. Her first major mission, along with Hosho, was sent to Chinese waters for the Shanghai incident, and in February of that year, her aircraft would engage, actually an American flying Allied aircraft, but there would be air fighting, and this would start to teach a lot. But in this configuration, she wouldn't last long. She is about 800 meters, original top speed of about 27 knots, and original weight of about 27 tons light, up to 34 tons fully loaded. Interestingly, she has 3 flight decks. A large one on top, which is about 560 feet, a tiny one in the middle, which is under 50 feet, and then a medium one at front, which is about 180 feet. And the 2 forward ones, they reminds me of like a cake, but in here, it actually goes straight into hangar area, so planes could take off straight from the hangars and fly out. That was the idea, leaving the top deck for landing. She didn't have catapults. She used a transverse arrestor gear system. She did have an armored hull, and she did have 8-inch guns for surface defense, as well as 5-inch dual-purpose guns. At this time, in America too, they really weren't sure aircraft carriers could defend themselves, so they were giving them guns. So she would start off with some 8-inchers. She would carry about 60 aircraft. Her early flight groups were about 28 bombers, dive or torpedo, well, early on just be torpedo, 16 fighters, and 16 scout/reconnaissance planes. And she originally had a crew of about 1,350. But it was very clear that this was a dated design, and so it was slated for reconstruction and to be refit before Akagi. So in 1933, it would go in for the said refit, which would last until 1935. By 1936, Kaga would look very much like Akagi that we're about to look at. With a smooth deck, they essentially plated over the smaller ones, turning her into more hangar space, giving her more fuel storage. She was able to carry up to 72 airplanes ready to go, plus 8 or 9 more in storage. She actually could have a total of about 90 planes, including spares, all on board. They would rework her engines, giving her a new top speed of almost 29 knots. They would rework her funnels, giving her new equipment. And her crew would jump to over 1,700, and her tonnage would jump to over 38,000, which, by the way, was more than the Washington Naval Treaty allowed, but by 1936, most aren't really giving a damn. And there would be multiple other things, including removing some of her gun batteries, adding more air defense, because in the beginning it was pretty light. And this really helped with fleet doctrine they were practicing. Her sister would go in for her own refit a short time later, but in 1937, Kaga would go to China for the Second Sino-Japanese War, and she would serve there quite intensively throughout that year in 1938, going in for brief resupply and refit occasionally, and updating her aircraft as technology improved. And then in 1939-40, she would go in for another major update. This was more for equipment, for example, on the bridge. She would also end up getting new aircraft like the A6M, the very famous Zero, as well as the B5N, the Kate, and the D3A, so bombers and all that. But at this point, her air group is increasing. She's got more space. And in April of 1941, the Japanese Fleet Command pretty much roll all of its carriers into one group. This was offensively very aggressive and very forward-thinking. At this time, most other nations were separating their carriers. Early on, they considered the carrier to be a support for battleship and a way to take out enemy battleships, later enemy carriers. But now they're thinking more offensively, grouping them together, and letting their combat air patrols, their CAPs, support each other. And from there, the modernized Kaga would join her sister ships and start training for what would become the attack on Pearl Harbor. In November, they would join up, they would take on supplies, and they would leave port by the end of that month. And of course, having their rendezvous with Destiny on December 7. Planes from Kaga would hit many battleships, including Nevada, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and yes, Pennsylvania, as well as destroying multiple aircraft on the ground. And her losses would be quite light, and afterwards she would return to friendly waters for a resupply and what have you. So it was quite a success for her. But like I said, this model is quite neat because it's in the early Shanghai incident configuration, still featuring biplanes. It's a very interesting look for the carrier. But again, it wouldn't last very long. Here she is, Akagi. This was the flagship of the First Air Fleet before enduring Pearl Harbor, and often served as the command ship, at least for the carrier groups. Originally, she was laid down also in 1920 as part of the Japanese buildup post-World War I as a battlecruiser, an Amagi-class battlecruiser. So she was designed to be faster than Kaga, but Kaga had more armor. As I already explained, of course, construction was halted when Japan signed the naval treaty, and after the Kanto earthquake, conversion began, turning her into a carrier at the end of 1923, so she underwent that much earlier than Kaga. And really, preliminary work was over by 1925, and she was commissioned into the fleet in March of 1927, and she would start working up that year, and was ready to go by 1928, becoming the second carrier in the Japanese fleet and the first true fleet carrier. She looked very much like Kaga over there. She had a longer top deck. Kaga's deck was about 560 feet. Akagi's was about 625, but the two smaller decks were the same. She carried about the same number of aircraft, but she was faster at over 32 knots because, again, she started off as a battlecruiser. And she was about the same weight overall, 27 light up to 34 fully laden before her refit. Since Kaga was more archaic, she would go in, and Akagi here would kind of be the main fleet for exercise, the main carrier for exercises in the 1930s. I should point out that in 1929, she was captained for a year by one Admiral, well, at the time Captain Yamamoto. Kind of an interesting little footnote. Anyway, after Kaga went through her rebuild, Akagi here would go in 1935, but it would actually take through 1938 to get it done. Even though the work was far less, they had less to do, it took much longer, partially just because of money and financing at the time. But eventually she would come out, and then she would relieve Kaga in Chinese waters in 1939, taking on board newer aircraft and taking part in various incidents there. 1940, she too would go in for some minor refitting. In April 1941, she would be assigned to the 1st Air Fleet and would be made the flagship. And so we'll start training up, working as carriers as a group. And again, working for Pearl Harbor towards that, taking on supplies from September to November, leaving port towards the end of that month, and attacking on December 7 with the same B-5Ns, D-3As supported by A-6M-0s. She too would attack several battleships, including Oklahoma, California, West Virginia, as well as the airfield at Pearl Harbor, and various tankers, and planes would even shoot down a B-7. As I was saying before being interrupted, planes from Akagi shot down a B-17. She launched multiple waves and suffered very light losses. At this time, she had a crew of about 1,650, so a little less than Kaga. She was a little bit longer, although Kaga would be stretched out at some points. She had a flight deck of about 850 feet, over 100 feet wide, and of course she had 8-inch guns initially, but these would be removed during the refit. During the refit, because of added weight, she would get over 40 tons. Her speed would actually dip below 32 knots, about 31 and a half knots, but the trade-off was several other things. After Pearl Harbor, she would kind of make her way back, but would support various operations when and where she was needed, moving into 1942. Ryujo, Prancing Dragon. Certainly an interesting concept, and frankly, it was probably more useful than it had any right to be, considering what a compromised design it was. The Japanese were not foolish. They were trying to do something here. It just didn't work out all that great. So we've got Hosho, we've got Kaga, we've got Akagi, but the Japanese have a pretty limited tonnage under the Washington Naval Treaty. However, that treaty does not count aircraft carriers under 10,000 tons towards the limit because they're not considered viable. They're considered experimental or support or, whatever. They're not really militarized craft. So, Japan thought they would build a series of under 10,000 tons, at least on paper, carriers. They would carry 24 aircraft and have a good top speed and what have you. So fast, carrying 24 planes, and since the treaty doesn't seem to care about them, they can build essentially as many as they want within, reason. So this is laid down at the end of 1929, and it's launched in 1931 and commissioned in 1933. One problem. In 1930, there was the London Naval Treaty, which closed this loophole. So the ship was under construction, but it was now going to count towards the overall tonnage. Well, what do you do? One thing the Navy decided in 1931 was to increase the fighter complement from 24 up to 48. They decided, well, if we have to count the weight, and they only have a little bit left, about 20,000 tons anyway, at least make it useful. So what they did, they double-deckered the hangar, one on top of the other. And it's worth pointing out the hull here that Ryujo is built on is very much a cruiser-style hull. Long and narrow, 2 screws. So if you think having a narrow hull and a double-decker bus on top would make something unstable, you are correct. But that's kind of Japanese design at this time. Now, it wasn't armored at all, which was kind of a negative, come to think of it. It's about 590 feet long, has a flight deck of about 515 feet, a crew of about 600, and a top speed of a little over 29 knots. So quite a bit faster than Hosho. She's defended by 5-inch guns, as well as, in the beginning, 15 caliber, well, the Japanese version of 50 caliber machine guns. Later, it would get the wonderful 25 millimeter 1-inch anti-aircraft gun. Sarcasm abounds. So, she's commissioned into the fleet and sets sail. And very quickly, they realize that she needs weight. Now, on paper, she was 8,000 tons. No one believed this. Everyone knew she was 10,000 tons, if anything, probably a little more. But, it was a small thing. And the U.S. was doing it too, as was Britain, so. But in 1934, she would go in for the first of many refits. She was way too top-heavy. She was way too wet, especially at high speed. They would add some bulge to the hull, and they would reduce her fighter complement on paper from 48 down to 37. In reality, in the beginning, she only carried about 18 aircraft, but this would go up as time would go on. But rarely would it go over 30, practicality's sake. They would rework the bridge, just trying to make her more seaworthy. It helped a little bit, but in 1935 she was caught in the 4th Fleet incident and did not fare well. So she was in for repairs for several months, went through a pretty major refit, and by this point her on paper weight was about 10,600 tons, and full load was over 12,000 tons. So the extra weight did help, but still yet. On a more interesting note, Ryujo here was used for early tests of dive bombing, carrying dive bombers. And so she would get those as an experiment, and once they proved really working out well for her, she would actually often have her torpedo bombers taken off. And in 1937, she was sent into Chinese waters for the Second Sino-Japanese War, and would engage using her new dive bombers there, going back and forth throughout 1938, operating alongside Hosho and others. She would also be one of the earlier carriers to get the, at the time new, A5M Claude, as we call it, a monoplane. And so she's operating one of the most modern fighters and bombers. And while her complement would change over time, it was usually something like 12 fighters and up to 18 bombers, give or take. So typically between 30 and 34 aircraft on board her. And that seems to be about the right comfortable level there. In 39, she would go in for another little refit, and then she'd be designated as a training vessel in 1940. And in the 1941, she would, be poking around, doing her thing. By this point, she'd at least kind of overcome her major flaws, but still wasn't a great design. And they originally were going to build a number of these, but they never did because the loophole that it was built to exploit disappeared, so there was no reason to ever build sister ships. But time and money were in it, so they were going to get their money's worth. December 1941, she was actually used to support operations during the invasion of the Philippines. Kind of a draw. Some success, some failure, lost a plane or two. But either way, moving on. She supported the landings there. In the 1942, she would go up against British shipping. In fact, she would go up against the HMS Executor, and she would be involved in the invasion of Java, and throughout March and April in the anti-shipping role, and her planes would claim a number of Allied vessels. And then she would get going again for another refit and resupply. By this point, she is operating the A6M, the Zero, as well as the B5N, the Kate. So pretty much the newest aircraft that Japan has. Moving into the Battle of Midway, she was assigned to the Northern Force, which would attack and invade the Aleutian Islands up in Alaska. And she would hit some ground targets, destroying some on the ground, losing a couple of planes, and she would hang out up there until July, at which time she would return home for resupply and her next assignment. So a little bit of a colorful there, and you can see how she's kind of being assigned to the secondary missions, the Philippines and the Aleutians and whatnot. And so far, so good. She missed being sunk by some British bombers a time or two, and again, went up against some warships, but more or less came out unscathed. Next, we have two actual sister ships of the Zuiho class. We have the Zuiho herself here. and we have the Shoho, her sister. These were part of that whole, invisible fleet, black fleet, hidden fleet that Japan was working on in the mid-30s. Both were laid down as submarine tenders, but they were designed in such a way that they could easily be converted or, even under construction, altered to become aircraft carriers or fuel tankers, the like. So, actually, the ship that would become Shoho was laid down first in 1934, with the ship that would become Zuiho laid down in 1935. Both were launched about a year later, and initially, like I said, commissioned under other names as submarine tenders. But in 1939, it was decided, we need more light carriers, so the conversion was underway. Zuiho would actually be first to be commissioned as a light aircraft carrier at the end of 1940, whereas Shoho here would be commissioned in November of 1941, just a week before the Pearl Harbor invasion, although she was still being fitted out and worked up, so she would not really be operational until January of 1942, whereas Zuiho was operational, but still a very new vessel herself. In the beginning, these had virtually the same specifications. They were about 674 feet long, had a crew of just shy of 800, had a top speed of about 28 knots, were defended by 5-inch guns, as well as the 25mm, the 1-inch anti-aircraft gun, yay, and were designed to carry 30 aircraft. And they could be of the newer style. There weren't any of the restrictions. They were certainly light carriers, but relatively competent for what they were. We will come back to Zuiho in a bit. I'll just say that she was used to ferry fighters and supplies early in the war, and her first major assignment was to be part of the main group for the Midway attack in June of 1942. Shoho, on the other hand, had a brief career. Like I said, she was still kind of getting ready to go in January, and one of her first missions was to kind of be a aircraft ferry and supply in Japanese waters. She would move around a little bit, February, March, April, but nothing big. Her big time to shine would come with the larger carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku for what would become the Battle of the Coral Sea. So she was to escort them there. My problem, there was already an aircraft shortage. So while she had 8 of the current A6M fighters, she also had to make do with 4 older A5M Claudes, as well as carrying a contingent of B5N Kates. She was only about half loaded up though, so yeah. They're already running out of aircraft, at least in this instance. I should point out that her name, Shoho, means Happy Phoenix, whereas Zuiho means Lucky Phoenix. Again, their naming conventions are pretty neat, frankly, if you ask me. So, she would sail into history in May of 1942. I wonder how she'll do. Here we have another seaplane tender conversion, the Chitose class. We have Chitose or Chitos herself. Cheetos, we'll go with that. And her sister ship, Chiyoda. These were laid down much like Zuiho and Shoho in 1934, 1935. And they actually were commissioned as seaplane tenders in 1938 and served in that role early in the war, even being present at the Battle of Midway as seaplane aircraft tenders. But with the losses at Midway, the decision was taken in January of 1943 to convert both into light aircraft carriers, and they had been designed from the outset to make this easy enough to do, and that's pretty much what they did throughout 1943. They were officially reclassed and recommissioned as carriers in November of 43, and both sister ships were ready for service in early 1944. Like Shoho and Zuiho over here, these were a little over 11,000 tons light and 14, even up to 15,000 tons fully laden. Chitose class was a little bit shorter at about 635 feet long, but still was made to carry 30 aircraft and actually had a slightly larger crew of about 800. She was also slightly faster at just shy of 29 knots and was defended by this pretty much usual mix of 5-inch guns and inch guns and what have yous. Pretty standard flight deck. Pretty standard arrangement for what we kind of expect at this point. So, both were rebuilt, reclassed, and they're kind of joining this auxiliary fleet, now being pulled into primary service with the losses at the Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal. What's funny though, by the time these were ready for service in 1944, there was a major aircraft shortage. So they didn't actually have aircraft, at least not for the time of their first major debut at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Both sisters were there, and both would be, frankly, used as part of the diversion force. And they essentially looked, well, pretty much the same to each other. But of course, we will revisit their fate later on in this here video. Again, very similar in general layout to the other converted vessels, but done a little bit later in the war, so a little bit more modern features, frankly. Well, let's move on. We next come to the Imperial Japanese Navy's true first purpose-built aircraft carrier. Although, to be sneaky, they tried passing it off as a flight deck cruiser to skirt the Washington Treaty, but yeah, it didn't work. This is Soryu. Along with her half-sister, Hiryu, they were ordered in the 1931-1932 fiscal year, and she was laid down in 1934, and her hull was launched in 1935. And she would be commissioned into the fleet at the end of 1937. And this model here is of her first cruise in 1938. So she still has biplanes on board. This was originally designed under the strictures of the Naval Treaty, although since they were pretty much done with it by the time she was in service, yeah, Interestingly, it's a cruiser-type hull. In fact, it uses the same engines as the Mogami class cruisers. So, when commissioned, this was the fastest aircraft carrier in the world at over 34 knots, 34.5 knots on trials even. Nominal weight was about 16,500 tons. Loaded up, it got over 19,000. Honestly, it was almost as long as Kaga at about 774 feet, but it was much more narrow, under 70 feet wide at the hull, and the flight deck at certain points would stretch out to 100, but only a little bit. So almost as long, and we had a flight deck of over 700 feet, so that's, good too. But little different. They didn't have quite the same, they didn't put 8-inch guns on her. She wasn't really armored. She had an operational flight group of about 61 planes, so almost as much as the larger carriers, but she did not carry near as many spares. That's kind of where that led off. Her crew was around 1,100 nominal. Of course, that would go up as the war would go. But yeah, Soryu was the first of her type, and really would be the first true Japanese built from the ground up aircraft carrier, and it would pretty much inspire everything else to come throughout the war. Her first cruise in 1938 would be to support operations in China, although she saw very light combat. It was essentially an extended shakedown cruise anyway. She would go back to port in 1939 and would go to support operations in the invasion of Indochina in 1940. And she would go in for a little bit of an update. She would be assigned to the 1st Air Fleet in April of 1941. Then she would actually be detached that summer to again support operations around Indochina. She would come back in August of 41 for a minor refit, and she was ready to start training up for the attack in October. So she would get a few minor updates, but mostly to her aircraft. And she would be there on December 7, launching the usual and attacking various targets. After Pearl Harbor, she actually would go support the offense to take Wake Island, which would surrender on December 22nd. And then after that operation, she would return to home waters to resupply, moving into 1942 like the rest of them. But it's an interesting carrier. It holds quite a lot, but it does have a lot of compromises for speed and weight. A little less range, a little less fuel than the bigger ones, so you can tell where they had to cut to make it work. But it was much more modern, using much more modern ideas of how aircraft and aircraft carriers should be used. And she directly led to her half-sister, as historians call it. But we'll get to her in a minute. Initially, Hiryu was supposed to be the same class and type as Soryu. But there was an incident known as the Fourth Fleet Incident, in which Japanese ships were caught out in the ocean by a major typhoon, and it really showed the deficiencies of a lot of weight up top, relative instabilities, so there was kind of a rush to rework the entire fleet. Soryu was well underway, so there was little that could be done, but Hiryu was not yet officially laid down, so the design was modified rather hastily. It was laid down in the summer of 1936, launched in November of 37, and commissioned into the fleet in July 1939. The major difference is it received more armor, so more weight down below, overall just heavier. It was slightly wider by about 4 feet. The forecastle was changed a bit. The tower was switched from the starboard to the port side. Kind of interesting. And overall, she was just a heavier vessel meant to withstand seas a bit more. She was about 17,500 tons light and about 20,500 tons loaded up. So about 1,000 more than Soryu. She was obviously in the fleet later. She carried a couple of extra planes, a total of 64 plus spares. Same as before, same top speed. In fact, she was right there in there with Soryu when commissioned. Overall, the same length of just about 750 feet, and had a flight deck of about 710 feet. Yeah, same basic operations, plus they tried to update the air defense with 40mm and 25mm guns, trying to be a little more modern. And she had a crew of 1,100. So after working up, she would be sent on detachment to help the invasion of French Indochina, and would operate alongside Soryu quite a bit, and then be assigned to the fleet. In fact, she was part of the 2nd Division. It would be the flagship of the 2nd Division of the 1st Air Fleet. Again, supporting operations in the summer of 1941. Hiryu would go in for a minor refit in August, just like Soryu. They would change back and forth, and would prepare for Pearl Harbor. Now, her time at Pearl Harbor was not quite as successful because her targets were supposed to be the aircraft carriers. They were not there. Her secondary target was the battleship USS Pennsylvania, which was also not there. So in the end, they just kind of went over whatever targets of opportunity they could find, and battleships and whatnot. It should be said that an aircraft from Hiryu was credited with delivering the killing blow to the USS Arizona that detonated her magazine. So there is that. And like Soryu, Hiryu would be kind of diverted to Wake Island after Pearl Harbor to help assault and help support the landings there on December 22nd, 23rd, and ultimately lead to the surrendering of the island, and eventually would make her way back home for resupply before heading back out again as 1942 rolled on. So at this point in time, things are looking up for the Japanese carriers, to be sure. Our next class is a little more difficult to type classify. When we looked at the light carriers, they're either experimental, like Hosho or Ryujo, or they're conversions of submarine tenders, seaplane tenders. Here we have the Hiyo class, which had 2 members, Hiyo and Junyo, which this model is actually of Junyo. And these are conversions, but a little different. The starting point, at least. In 1938, these were laid down as luxury passenger liners, nominally privately owned by the Japanese company NYK, but they were over half subsidized, about 60%, I think, by the Japanese government, i.e. the Japanese Navy. This was because they wanted them built to a standard where they could easily be converted into, you guessed it, aircraft carriers. To that end, they were fitted with a double hull. The internal bulkheads and arrangements were done so that they could have hangars, fuel storage. They were made where they could support an island and guns. The main deck was reinforced. In fact, the deck heights inside were higher than would have been needed with a passenger liner. So, yeah, easy conversion. Now, one point of disagreement between the Navy and NYK, NYK really only wanted a ship capable of 20 to 22 knots, maybe 24 knots in a pinch. The Navy wanted something faster. about 26 knots at least, 28 even better. Eventually, a compromise was reached where that in peacetime, the turbines would be limited to 80%, but in wartime, the restriction could be removed if necessary. This effectively gave it a max speed of 23 to 24 knots, but if the limitations were removed, it was about 25 to 25 and a half knots. The reason that NYK didn't want faster was efficiency, fuel efficiency. When you're paying for fuel, it matters. So, yeah. So these were laid down as passenger liners under different names, but we're not going to get into that. And even before Pearl Harbor, yeah, the Japanese Navy exercised its right to purchase these in February, and so construction was switched to making them into aircraft carriers. And they were not meant to be fleet carriers or even light carriers. They were classed as auxiliary carriers, meaning second line use, kind of more as aircraft ferries, support vehicles, defense vehicles, what have you. And even though the class is named Hiyo, and Hiyo was launched first, Junyo here actually was commissioned first in May of 1942. So still during the good times. And so in the beginning, she was an auxiliary carrier and was in service right around the time of, well, right after the Battle of the Coral Sea and right before the Battle of Midway. Both sisters have very similar specifications. They're just under 720 feet long with a flight deck of just over 690 feet. So, yeah, in between a light carrier and a fleet carrier. They are quite wide. The hull is about 88 feet with the flight deck about 90 feet at its widest. That's getting very close to fleet carrier, so they are quite wide. Like I said, top speed was about 25 and a half knots. However, they really like to cruise at about 22 knots max. And when they did this, they had very good range for their size, over 11,000 miles, which was comparable to the biggest fleet carriers. So the fuel efficiency, not bad. They weren't terribly fast, and they weren't the most maneuverable, but because of their wide and kind of heavy construction, they were actually very stable. So kind of the opposite of Ryujo. One good thing. Of course, they didn't really have much armor to speak of because passenger liner, and that's kind of how Navy ships were going. They had dual-purpose 5-inch guns, and of course they had 25mm and 40mm air defense guns. They were intended to have an air group of up to 54 planes, including spares. The original layout called for 12 fighters and 18 each dive bombers and torpedo bombers, plus a couple of spares for each class. And they originally were outfitted with A6Ms and B5Ns and D3As. So they had reasonable specs, again, right in between a light carrier and a fleet carrier as far as capacity for aircraft. They had a couple of elevators. One interesting thing, they were the first Japanese carrier to have the funnel integrated into the island on the starboard side. And the island itself was kind of tilted or kilted over to not be in the way of the flight deck and all that. So a little bit of innovation there. They would have been very good auxiliary carriers. And Junyo would receive her first assignment at the end of May, along with Ryujo. She would be sent to support the invasion of the Aleutian Islands up in Alaska, launching her first sortie late on June 3rd and continuing through. At this time, she was carrying fighters and bombers, and the first results were mixed. She did some damage to ground targets, but she also lost 5 aircraft of each type. Again, very new vessel though, so give a little bit there. Now, This would be after the Battle of Midway. In July, she was reclassed from auxiliary carrier to standard carrier because they needed her. Hiyo, who was just now being commissioned, never was officially auxiliary. She was always a standard fleet carrier because she was a little bit later and came in after the fact. I should point out that their air groups would shift upwards. They would go from 12 A6Ms up to 18, up to 21, and even up to 27 at some points. And to make room, they would sacrifice first the B-5Ns, the torpedo bombers, and then eventually they would reduce the D-3As down to 9, the dive bombers, because, you know, fighters and the way the war was going for them. But they were in need, and the battle for Guadalcanal was raging August and throughout the rest of 1942, and both sisters would be there. After a bit of busy work, they would be sent to the Solomon Islands area and kind of in an anti-shipping role. They would attack the tender Seth MacFarlane, doing damage but not sinking her. So, yeah, some success there. They would also sink some transport and cargo vessels. But then Hiyo would have mechanical problems. This is essentially her first real cruise. And this really highlighted a problem because the gears, the engines, and the machinery was meant for a passenger liner. It wasn't as reliable as it could have been on a military vessel. So Hiyo had to go back to home waters for repair and refurbishment. But Junyo would continue. She would be there at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Her aircraft would launch attacks on several Allied vessels, including the battleship South Dakota, doing some damage. And she would take part in helping sink the USS Hornet. Now, her planes would not deliver the killing blow, the coup de grace, but at least one torpedo from a plane here would hit Hornet, kind of helping her down. So some success there. Moving into November, she was assigned to escort Japanese transports during the naval battle of Guadalcanal, and this did not go so well. She would lose 7 with another 4 or 5 damaged under her watch, so not great. Throughout December and into January, she would continue to escort and then go back. Throughout 1943, basically, once Hiyo is back and working, they would serve as transports, kind of moving in and out of the Japanese port of Truk and delivering aircraft. Their planes would be detached from time to time, yada yada. In June of that year, Hiyo, kind of the bad luck of the group, would get hit by a torpedo and have to go in for repairs. And then later, Junyo would have her turn, getting hit by a torpedo, and again going in for repairs. So that would be kind of what's going on there. Once they're back operational, they would resume duties as kind of ferries. Into 1944. Finally, in April, the two sisters plus Ryujo would meet up and be regrouped and new air groups formed. At this point, there's a severe lack of aircraft for them, but they kind of consolidated various air groups trying to get planes on them. So they began training up April of 1944 for their next assignment, which they would leave on that May. And they would have their own rendezvous with history. But it's an interesting vessel. It's only about 24,000 tons, maybe a little more light, which would, that seems like a heavy fleet carrier. But because of its starting point as a passenger liner with a lot of weight and a very wide hull, yeah, there are compromises here. Its weight doesn't really belie its full capabilities. Keep in mind that at some points, Kaga and Akagi were only about 28,000 tons light, so she wasn't much lighter than them at the beginning, but yeah, it's a little illusory. And on the other hand, she does carry more aircraft than many of the light carriers. So, yeah, not the worst, but not the best. It was just part of that kind of quiet fleet. It's interesting that these were laid down well after the abrogation of the Washington and London treaties. I think it had more to do with economics and politics, the whole Navy helping fund it with private ownership, yada yada. Just kind of, yeah, politics and monies involved here. But we'll, of course, revisit this to talk about fate later on. Now we come to a couple of the most impressive fleet carriers, not only in Japan, but in all of World War II. The two members of the Shokaku class, Shokaku herself and Zuiho. And these were the first carriers designed in Japan after the strictures and limitations of the treaties were gone. They were first budgeted for in 1937, and planning began in 1938, and construction would begin a short time later. The two sisters are very similar, except for Shokaku has a little bit of a bulge on her port side, because originally the island was to be there, but it was decided early on during the construction phase to move it to the starboard side. Experiences had shown that was, better. Zuikaku, since it was not as far along in the construction, never really had this kind of artifact. Otherwise, they're very, very similar. They were both launched and they were both commissioned in 1941. Shokaku would be slightly earlier in August, with Zuikaku coming in September of 1941. So they were ready just in time for the Pearl Harbor mission. In fact, that was their very first assignment, was to start training up for that, and they would join the fleet, and they would be there. This model is of Shokaku. Eaglemoss does make Zuikaku, but it's a very rare model because it's late in the series, and I haven't been able to find it. In fact, just finding this one was challenging enough, so there you go. This is a true fleet carrier. It's about 32,000 tons. It's 845 feet long, 95 feet wide. And the idea, this was a modified Hiryu class. And they pretty much wanted everything here. They wanted the aircraft carrying capabilities of Akagi. They wanted the protection of Kaga. They wanted the speed of Soryu and Hiryu. Plus, they wanted just better protection, range, endurance, modernization than them all. And essentially, that's what they got. This was planned to have an active air group of 72, plus up to 24 reserves, so a total of up to 96, although in reality it never quite had that many. About 84 was the most ever stationed on one. It had 3 elevators. It had 2 hangars, one on top of the other, although the lower was just for fighters. Had a top speed of 34.5 knots, so very good for its size. It was actually quite maneuverable and efficient. It had decent range, slightly less than Akagi, just under 10,000 miles. I should point out that the hull, the rudder, a lot of that was designed after the hydrodynamic studies that were done for the battleship Yamato. So the hull somewhat resembles a battleship versus, say, a cruiser, what have you. If she, of course, was defended with 5-inch guns, as well as the 25mm and 40mm, and of course this would be improved over time. In fact, Shokaku would be the first ship to get radar, first surface, and air and surface search radars over time. Just a very impressive vessel for all things. These were actually the first to have really adequate torpedo protection, belt protection too, because they felt like torpedoes were the main threat to carriers, not, shells from enemy battleships. So they're starting to kind of get that modern notion. what else? Yeah, they're pretty much about the same. Kind of got an interesting double rudder arrangement on these. 4 screws. Initially, they were to carry 18 fighters plus spares, 27 each torpedo and dive bombers plus spares. But, of course, they would start carrying more and more fighters as the war went on, something we see with other carriers at this time. So what about Pearl Harbor? Since Zuikaku and Shokaku were the newest ships and still training up, especially their air groups, they were given the easiest targets at Pearl Harbor, the airfields and such. They decided to save the naval assets for the more experienced crews. And they would contribute first D3As, over 50 of them, to the first wave, and over 50 B-5N torpedo bombers to the second wave. Plus, they would contribute about a dozen A6Ms for the combat air patrol and just overall defense. They would lose a couple of aircraft during the event, but it was, generally speaking, successful for them. And like the rest of the fleet, they would withdraw. Their next assignment would come in January of 1942, when they would support the invasion of Rabaul against Australian forces, kind of securing the flank for Japan. And they would move forward from there. They would practice some anti-shipping, some harassment. They would be involved in the Indian Ocean raids moving into March. And then in April, they would be involved in the assault on Colombo. And it's here they kind of first made a name for themselves. Planes from Shokaku and Zuikaku were credited with primarily sinking HMS Hermes, the British light carrier. Their D3As were the first to find and really assault. They would also sink or damage a few other British assets. After that, they would return to port and prepare for what would become the Battle of the Coral Sea. And they would be accompanied by the light carrier Shoho. And the battle did not start off great for the Japanese, Shoho, but it went okay for both of these. Well, Zuikaku anyway. He would prove to be the lucky one. A rain squall pretty much hid her from detection by the Allies. Shokaku would be hit by, I think it was 3 bombs, disabling her flight deck, but she was not in no danger of sinking. And on the other hand, they would do major damage to USS Yorktown at the battle, and ultimately lead to the scuttling of USS Lexington. And afterwards, they would withdraw. They would hit bad weather going back to Japan to repair Shokaku. She was patched up only. The bad weather wreaked havoc with her, already damaged state, and it was a little touch and go, but she survived, and she would go in for repairs. This is why neither ship was there for the Battle of Midway. With Shokaku out of the action, and with Zuikaku being so new, they didn't want to put both carriers out, or at least the other one. Ultimately, they would hold them in reserve that summer in case there were attacks on the Japanese home islands. Repairs to Shokaku were done by August, and so they would be sent into the Guadalcanal campaign. First the East Solomons, and then later the Battle of Santa Cruz. She is now joined by the light carrier Ryujo in August, and some brilliant person decided to send Ryujo is a different one, ahead, which would lead to her own fate, leaving Shokaku and Zuikaku to ultimately engage the USS Enterprise and USS Saratoga. And while the two would trade blows, the 4 really would trade blows, ultimately they would withdraw without any real decisive anything. And moving forward into October, they would practice a little anti-shipping early on, and then be part of the battle on October 26th. Yet again, Shokaku would be hit by multiple bombs, doing damage. And yet again, Zuikaku would be pretty much hidden from detection thanks to the weather. Planes from them would help sink the USS Hornet ultimately, creating blows, putting damage on other ships, so on and so forth. And while both ships did survive, all these engagements, they're losing their aircraft. They lost a good number in the Coral Sea, they lost a few in the Solomons, and now they lost more of their air group in the Battle of the Santa Cruz. So that's becoming the main problem. They're losing their experienced pilots and aircraft, yada, yada. And of course, Shokaku is yet again damaged, so she has to go in for repairs. Zuikaku will be split off in January of 43 to help support the withdrawal from Guadalcanal. And from that point on, 1943 is pretty uneventful for the Japanese Navy. They do a lot of ferry missions, go in and out of truck, move planes around. They do have a sortie later on that year to try to find the American carriers, but it's unsuccessful. And they go into port. Eventually, in February of 1944, they're reassigned to Singapore. And then in April, they receive orders to go to the Philippines, which they will leave for the next month. And that's where Shokaku and Zuikaku have kind of their own rendezvous with history. But we'll get to that in a bit. Cool carrier, very big, kind of rivaling the best that America and the UK can build. And they did become better with the Type 21 radar sets being installed, newer aircraft. They would get the newer dive bombers and multi-role aircraft like the D-4Y, and of course their fighter complement would be increased. These had a crew of about 1,660, give or take. I don't think that includes the air group though, but I could be wrong. So very much a true fleet carrier, and really the only major assets, at least carrier assets, the Japanese Navy had in 1943 and 1944. Because all the other fleet carriers were essentially lost at Midway. I wonder how well that'll work out for them. The Taiho, meant to be the ultimate Japanese carrier, designed to both dish it out and take it. Funding for this was initially approved in 1939, and the ship here was laid down in July of 1941, so before war. But she would not be launched until 1943 and was not commissioned until March of 1944. This is a modified, updated Shokaku class. So there's a lot of similarities with the hull, the rudder system, the screws, but the major differences have to do with protection. She was the first Japanese carrier to have an armored flight deck with about 3 inches of steel covered with the latex coating for anti-slip and whatnot, so getting away from the wood. Her upper hangar wasn't really armor protected, but her lower hangar was. The ammunition stores were protected. She had improved belt armor for torpedo protection as well as internal torpedo protection. So they armored her up. She was light at about 32,000 tons and heavy at over 37,000 tons. So right in there with Akagi and Kaga. And she is a little bit larger than Shokaku, well, at least lengthwise, about 855 feet. She's slightly more narrow, though, at about 90 feet versus 95 at the hull. And she had the largest flight deck, at least until the Shinano came along, which was a converted Yamato-type battleship. But it was about 845 feet long and over 90 feet wide, so quite a large deck there. She was intended, well, the flight group's a little fluctuating-y. When designed, they were hoping to get as many as 96 planes on her, plus up to 30 spares. This would fluctuate up and down, getting as low as 53 at some point. But when she actually sailed, she had about 65 planes on her initially, which is probably about all they could muster at that time. It goes to show you, though, she could carry a lot of aircraft for her day and time. She was quite fast for her size, too, at over 33 knots, so slightly slower than the previous fleet carriers, but still, plenty fast. Still a little bit faster than America's carriers at the time. She also had new air defense. She had the new 3.9-inch electrically powered AA guns, plus, of course, a healthy helping of the 25mm guns and others. And while she was not initially designed with radar, this was quickly integrated into the design during construction. So she would come out with air and surface search radar. She also had improved facilities for an admiral to be a flagship. And she had a crew of over 1,750. So a bit more than Shokaku. And she was designed to use the latest aircraft. Not just the A6M and the D4Y, but she could have used the A7M, the replacement, the B6N, even the B7, other larger planes. And she had elevators designed where the wings could be unfolded as they were brought from the hangar deck to the flight deck to go, just to speed up things. They tried to put a lot of thought into her. So she was finally ready for service in March of 1944, at a time when Japan only had a couple of fleet carriers left. She would go to Singapore in April for training alongside Shokaku and Zuikaku, and on April 15, the admiral would transfer his flag over to Taiho. Again, better facilities for it. And they would continue training up for the air group. In May, they would launch a few little raids on the Marianas Islands and kind of just move into the area next to the Philippine Sea. And it would be there that she would have her big combat debut. Now think about it. If we've got this new armored fleet carrier, plus Zuikaku and Shokaku, those are three very capable fleet carriers. Plus, we still have some light carriers left. On paper, this is not a shameful force to have. Of course, America, by this point, had the Essex class, so there's that. So how did Taiho do on her maiden voyage, her combat debut? We begin our talk of the ending, the fate of these carriers, with the Shoho. Like I said, she would go into what we would know today as the Battle of the Coral Sea, and it started off quite well for her. On May 3rd, she helped support the landings at Tulagi, and she was able to perform her role there and get out before being detected by the USS Yorktown's scout aircraft. She was in the area, so she withdrew undetected. She would be detected by the U.S. Army Air Corps a couple of days later, May 5th, but she was out of range. So she would support various operations for a few days, and her luck would run out on May 7. She would be detected by scout aircraft from the USS Lexington, and therefore she would have bombers launched against her. Her combat air patrol was only a couple of old A5M Claudes and one A6M0, but then a wave of SBD Dauntlesses came in, bombers, and tried attacking her. But this was pretty ineffective, and Shoho would reinforce her cap with 3 more A6Ms. The next wave of bombers, though, would score a couple of good hits with 1,000-pound bombs, which would penetrate the flight deck And the usual story with Japanese carriers: fires would get started, fuel would go, firefighting was less than effective. So this left her already a little bit crippled, but still afloat. Then some TBD Devastators would come in. Now, the Devastator does not have a great combat record, but this time they actually were able to successfully deliver their torpedoes. American torpedoes were not great either, but still yet they did damage. This was followed up by another wave of bombs from SBDs, many of which hit. Ultimately, Shoho would take 13 bomb hits at least, and 7 torpedo hits at least, although I'm not sure if all torpedoes successfully detonated. Regardless, it was more than enough to start fires, make hull breaches, and it wasn't long. She did not have to be scuttled. She would go under the waves a little after 11:30 that morning. Unfortunately, many of the crew would go with her. Only about 300 would escape, and of these, only about 200 would be rescued by Japanese vessels later. So, heavy loss of life, about 2/3 of the crew. And this would be Japan's first carrier loss of the war. However, while this is not ever good, it really did not break their winning streak, because America would lose the USS Lexington there, and the USS Yorktown would receive rather major damage. So Japan lost 1 light carrier in exchange for 1 fleet carrier lost and 1 fleet carrier damaged. So all in all, still a net positive. It also helped that Shoho was not fully laden with aircraft, so there was not a major loss of aircraft, which would become very soon a very important resource for Japan. So the Battle of the Coral Sea really wasn't seen as a major defeat for Japan, and losing their first carrier was kind of inevitable. It's war. However, the next battle, the next loss, would not be something they could so easily shrug off. So here we are, lined up. 1942 started off quite good for the carriers. Their luck held. Soryu and Hiryu operated together most of January. Akagi and Kaga did their own thing, but they would meet up in February, because on the 19th they would launch a successful assault on Darwin, Australia. It didn't lead to an invasion, but they did sink 8 ships and did some damage. From there, they would go into the Indian Ocean raids, although Kaga would be peeled off. She had hit a reef earlier, temporarily repaired, but needed to go in for more major repairs, so it was Akagi and Soryu and Hiryu. And they would move on, eventually going to Java, helping that effort, and in April attacking Colombia. At this point, their idea is to kind of break the British fleet, and they would sink cruisers, and they would sink the HMS Hermes, a British carrier, although an old one. And so things are still looking quite good. A little damage here, a little damage there. They would put in for a little rest and repair and refit, and be rejoined by Kaga, and then at the end of May they would leave for Midway Island. Because the U.S. carriers were not there at Pearl Harbor, they wanted to draw them out and finish them off. Now, the U.S. had lost Lexington, and Yorktown was damaged, and the Japanese had really only lost Shoho. Because of the events of the Coral Sea, the Battle of the Coral Sea, Shokaku and Zuikaku were not available. One was damaged, the other one wasn't, so these were held back. So they only sent these 4 carriers to Midway. But that should have been enough, because America only had 3 carriers, with 1 of them damaged. But of course, America also had Midway Island. It's a thing, you can read all about it. And as you know, this is where the tables, they do a turnin'. At first, from about 7 a.m. till 9 a.m., things were still going in the Japanese favor. Most American assaults were fruitless, but they were wearing the Japanese down. Because there were problems with Japanese operations of their carriers. They had good offensive punch, but their radio communications were poor. Their radar was substandard. Their anti-air was substandard, either the guns or their combat air patrol, because it was a little light. They didn't really have armor, and their fire suppression was less than ideal. So the Americans were wearing them down. So really between 10:20 and 10:30 that morning, 3 out of the 4 carriers would end up mortally wounded. The hardest hit was Kaga. She was hit by 3 500-pound bombs and a 1,000-pound bomb. Did a lot of damage and actually killed over 800 crew, the most of any fatalities. Next was Soryu. She was hit multiple times by 3,000-pound bombs directly, plus near misses. And actually, for her size, considering she had less crew, her ratio of loss was even higher, because she would lose over 700 men. It was bad. These were the 2 that were really targeted. Interestingly, Akagi wasn't initially targeted, but a few planes decided, you know what, she looks lonely. They peeled off, and all of their bombs missed or were near misses, except for one little old 1,000-pounder that just happened to hit just right and penetrated and set her ablaze too. So while at first it might seem recoverable, in the end it was not. Of course, this didn't all happen immediately. None of them would sink right away, but they would catch flame uncontrollably. The crews would be taken off, and at various times they would be ordered to be scuttled with torpedoes throughout the afternoon. That left Hiryu, who was the lucky one out of the bunch. While her sisters were being bombarded, she got away more or less scot-free, and would continue operations, sending out several waves that afternoon, and would ultimately end up sinking the USS Yorktown, or planes rather. And she would continue operations into 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock that afternoon. And at first her luck really held, up until about 5:30 when it finally ran out. And as she was essentially retreating, or at least maneuvering away for another attack later on, she was finally hit. Now at this point her air group had suffered quite heavy losses, although she took some planes on board from her ill-fated sister ships. But in the end, she were sunk too. Well, eventually. They kind of fought it throughout the night. There were fires, there were things, but she would continue on throughout the night, even though they would take crew off. It would not be until after 9 a.m. the next day, June 5th, that she would finally go down. So she was a stubborn ship, which makes sense. She was the youngest, and in some ways most modern. And so it went from a situation of the Japanese having 6 fleet carriers, the Americans having 3, to the Japanese having 2 fleet carriers compared with America's 2 operational. Much better odds. But it was just the giant blow. Like I said, Kaga and Soryu would lose together over 1,500 men, and the other ships would lose, give or take, 300. So it was pretty devastating. Over 2,000 sailors lost. Not to mention all the planes and many trained crews, and quite a bit of the high command. A lot of captains and even an admiral or 2. It wasn't the immediate turning point that history makes it out to be. It took time, but it leveled the playing field, and it started the turn. That would happen later on, and that's a subject for another day. But if you like talking about these and you're enjoying these little models, again, check out my personal channel where I'm doing an expanded version. I talking about other carriers like Hosho and Taiho and Junyo. All fun stuff because they're all kind of very colorful. But the Japanese really did push carrier operations forward. The thing is, what they started, America would end with the Essex class. So there's that. So after the rather potent loss in Midway, what about the fate of the kind of funny treaty carrier Ryujo? Well, like I said, she would go in for a resupply and refit at the end of July, and then in August she would be assigned along with Shokaku and Zuikaku to support the Guadalcanal campaign. And from there, she would be sent out on August 24, supported by the cruiser Tone. It's kind of a probing scouting mission, and her aircraft were assigned to attack Henderson Field. She had 24 A6M0 fighters and 9 B5N Kate bombers. Unfortunately for her, this assault was relatively ineffective. Some F-4F Wildcats would kind of harry her. First, fighters from the USS Enterprise would locate her and attack. This was pretty ineffective. But then fighters from USS Saratoga would give it a go, and Ryujo would be hit by 3 bombs and 1 torpedo. This was already a relatively unstable and very much unarmored aircraft carrier. So, yeah, it didn't take long. She would be ordered abandoned and go under a short time later. Loss of life was not as severe as with the Shoho. About 120 souls were lost, plus some pilots who, upon returning, had the ditch in the ocean. But supporting destroyers were able to come alongside and take a majority of the crew off before it was too late. And so, for what we know today as the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, Ryujo was lost. And it would kind of start a trend of, well, the Shoho would start it, but it kind of continues the trend of don't be the light carrier ordered to support Shokaku and Zuikaku. It just doesn't seem to end well. First Shoho and now Ryujo. But of course, this was not a major loss for the Japanese, but it did take down a number of aircraft with her and trained pilots, which were probably more of a long-term effect than the carrier herself, plus of course her seamen. But that was her war, quite brief overall, under a year. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. 1943 was relatively quiet for the Japanese Navy, but unfortunately for them, this was the time the U.S. needed to really build up its fleet. More Essex carriers, training more pilots, developing newer, better aircraft. For example, the F-6F coming in to replace the F-4F, as well as the F-4U coming into use. Japan had some advancement, but they're starting to feel the crunch in resources and personnel. And things would heat up again in 1944 as the U.S. pushed to take back territory, and the Japanese Navy found itself on the defensive for shore. The tide had surely turned. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19th, 1944. All of the carriers that Japan could muster were there. They had a total of 9 carriers. Zuikaku, Shokaku were there. Hiyo and Junyo were there. We had the light carriers Zuiho, as well as the conversions Chiyoda and Chiyoda, another light carrier that I don't have a model of, Ryujo, which was actually a pretty pathetic carrier, but yeah. And so on and so forth. About the only one not there was Hosho. And, of course, those at the bottom of the ocean. That spring, the Navy was they regrouped. They were out of planes and, more importantly, out of skilled pilots. So they started new air groups and everything in May, started training. But they found that their ships were bottled up, thanks to American submarines. They would prepare to leave in June, and then the U.S. fleet would be in the area around June 12. They would leave on the 13th, and on the 18th, the Japanese would actually spot the American fleet first. So early in the morning of June 19, they launched a couple of waves of reconnaissance, about 30 reconnaissance planes in total. The problem is, this is kind of an eggs in one basket situation. All the carriers were there, and they mustered the few hundred aircraft they had left, A6Ms. At this point, they're using two versions of the A6M. One is more of a fighter-bomber, one is a true fighter. They have a few of the new B6s. They've got some D4s. At least some of the older aircraft, like the B5 Kate, are out, but they're doing what they can. The problem is the crews and the pilots are not too experienced. Of course, Shokaku and Zuikaku were seasoned carriers at this point, but Taiho over here, it was her first real outing. So at first, the Japanese spotted the Americans, and they launched about the biggest wave they could. It consisted of about 50 bombers, escorted by a little over a dozen fighters. And it would locate the American fleet. It originally was going after the American carriers, but for whatever reason, they diverted when they found the American battleships. This gave the Americans time to launch their own fighters, 199 of the new F-6F Wildcats. And it was a rout. Only a handful of F-6 were shot down, and the Japanese of this wave, only about 20 of the aircraft returned, so they lost 2/3 right then and there. And then, of course, the battle was on. Taiho. The morning did not start off right for her. She was spotted by a U.S. submarine who launched 6 torpedoes. She didn't even spot the sub. But she did maneuver. She was preparing to launch aircraft. So she evaded 4 torpedoes almost by accident. A 5th torpedo was spotted by one of her planes, which dove into it and took the hit. So only one little torpedo was left that hit. And it punched one little hole, which should not have been a problem for a carrier designed to be able to take a hit. And at first, it wasn't too bad. Now the thing is, Taiho did ride low in the water, so it did have danger of flooding, but they did some changes, yada yada. Things seemed under control for a while. In fact, they resumed operations about 9:30 that morning, and they continued to fly waves at 11 o'clock and so on and so forth. The problem is it ruptured fuel line, and this built up fumes in the enclosed hangar space, and there was no good way to ventilate it. Eventually, after noon, the damage control team decided to turn the ventilation system to high, but at this point, fumes had built up so much that all this did was spread them around. They tried doing things like breaking out portholes and whatnot, but it didn't work. Eventually, about 2:30 in the afternoon, there was the first of many explosions, which caused her to go even lower in the water. There would be a second explosion about 4:30, by which point the Admiral was already abandoning ship. The explosions would buckle the flight deck, and the thing about the armored deck worked great for keeping things out, but, explosions under it kind of trapped it all in, and it was all bottled up there. The problem is, they put a lot of the armor around the bombs, the ordnance, but they didn't really have the fuel systems well protected. They were a little bit protected by concrete, but not enough. So Taiho was lost on her first mission via, frankly, one torpedo hit. Although, for being generous, one torpedo hit followed by several calls from an inexperienced team. So there you go. Probably wasn't a great thing to see their brand new, possibly last fleet carrier go glug, glug, glug. Next, we have the two sisters, Shokaku and Zuikaku. They were there. And yet again, Shokaku was the unlucky one. She would receive 3 to 4 torpedo hits from Allied bombers, maybe subs too. I really don't remember. Either way, the main thing was this would start off secondary explosions, which would lead to one of her own bombs going off because they weren't really protected. And having your own ordnance go off under decks is not good. It leads to you going under, and that's what happened to Shokaku during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Her sister, Zuikaku, continued to have better luck. She survived the initial onslaught and actually was retreating with the fleet. She was hit by a bomb, which did do some damage, but she was able to limp away. So, of the 3 fleet carriers there, 2 of them were definitively lost, and 1 of them was temporarily damaged. And one of Hiyo and her sister Junyo, they were both there, and Hiyo too was hit by a couple of bombs and 1 torpedo, which actually did a lot of initial damage. One of them was very near the bridge, which killed the commanding staff, buckling the deck, leading to secondary explosions, and another one hit basically by the engine room, knocking out. So she didn't have power, and her days were numbered. Junyo would fare better. She would also take a couple of hits, knocking out her flight deck, but along with Zuikaku, she was able to retreat. A lot of the other light carriers actually survived. So those are the 4 major losses at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. So out of the 9 carriers total, they lost nearly half. But more importantly, at this battle they had pretty much all of their airplanes, and at the end they retreated with just over 100, many of which had some damage. And again, the few pilots they had that were trained, that had skills, were lost. So they lost well over 2/3 of their aircraft, and they lost a lot of personnel. A lot of the ships, when they went under, took a majority of their crew with them. It was a devastating blow. So much so that in July, after the battle, a lot of the air groups were just disbanded. They didn't have enough to keep going. And more importantly, they only have 1 fleet carrier left, supported by a handful of light carriers, which themselves are conversions from other ships. And that gets us to our next battle of the year, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Excuse Shokaku here. She can be a stand-in for her sister. Zuikaku was the flagship of the fleet because it's the only carrier of fleet size they had left. And at this point, they just didn't have enough aircraft or capabilities, so the carriers were essentially going to be thrown away. They were decoys, hoping to lure the Allies away as they march across the Pacific. So that's the plan. In total, the carriers that were there, which included Zuiho over here, and both members of the Chitose and Chiyoda classes, as well as, of course, handful of support ships. Anyway, they were only able to muster about a little over 100 aircraft in total. So, yeah. They would leave for this mission on the 20th, and on the 24th, the engagement began. I should point out about Zuiho here. She had gone through a minor refit before the Battle of the Philippine Sea, namely extending her flight deck forward a bit. That's why on the model it's a little bit longer than on her sister. She also got new aircraft defense, more 25mm guns, of course, but also some anti-aircraft rocket batteries are starting to be installed. Just thought I'd point that out. So, during the battle on the 24th, at first the Allies did not detect the diversionary fleet here. Even though they were trying to get their attention, frankly, they would launch waves, but they would detect them late in the day. But frankly, it was just a minor thing at that point. The U.S. had bigger things to do. So they kept tabs on them throughout the night. And in the morning, the Japanese continued to launch waves of fighters to try to bug them out. But it really didn't do anything. They went up against Allied air defense, which just basically they were just throwing their planes away for no reason. And unfortunately for them, they kept very few planes back on the ship for reserve or for the cap. So when the Allies did decide to engage them that morning, 7, 8 o'clock, there wasn't much they could do. The primary Allied wave was 60 F-6F Hellcat fighters and 55 of the new TBF or TBM Avenger bomber, as well as 65 of the new SB-2C bomber. So relatively new aircraft, and total of about 180 plus others in reserves and what have you. It did not go well. Zuikaku would still kind of continue to be lucky. She would take one hit from a bomb on the rear of her deck, temporarily knocking out her flight deck, but they were able to render repairs. And then the second wave of attacks would actually focus on the Chitose and the Chiyoda, doing damage to those instead, ignoring the larger ship. So for a time she was allowed to make repairs, but oops, sorry guys. But then the third wave would go for her, and she would be hit again by bombs and torpedoes. The fourth wave, after 3 o'clock that afternoon, would actually miss her, but there were enough near misses that secondary damage would finally be enough to make her list over and eventually go under. So that was the end of the last fleet carrier on the afternoon of October 25th there. Yeah. The two ships of this class would also be sunk. They had very few aircraft on board, and it was a combination of shells from surface ships, torpedoes from destroyers, and bombs from bombers. Glug. And Zuiho, who had hung in the war longer than most, would also meet a very similar fate. Why did I leave? Where did I? I don't remember. Yeah, why did I leave this one here? Honestly, I forgot. Either way, she would be one of the few carriers to survive in the Japanese Navy after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, because this was it. Pretty much all of the reigning aircraft were there. They lost at least 4 carriers. That was pretty much all they had left. At this point, it's the scraps for what it is. Glug, glug, glug. And again, they knew this. This was a delaying action, almost a kamikaze action, frankly. Well, How did the war end? Junyo, the would-be passenger liner, would actually survive the war. Sort of. Again, sorry for leaving here in the frame when doing the Leyte Gulf talk, but hey, I've been at this a while. In October, when the Battle of Leyte Gulf was going on, she was actually transporting cargo between Japanese holdings. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, her air group, such as it was removed, and she became a glorified transport. In November of 1944, she would be attacked by a submarine, but her escorting destroyer would put herself in the path of a torpedo, saving Junyo, although dooming herself. But it was only a temporary measure. Not even a month later, in December, she would be spotted and attacked by another sub, and this time she would take 3 torpedo hits, which did some pretty good damage, but I guess a testament to her stability and construction, she was able to limp home to Sasebo and put in the week before Christmas for repairs. And they would start to repair Junyo, but in March of 1945, repairs were halted. They still weren't done. They had no need for. The resources were very limited. They didn't need a carrier, so they just stopped. What they would do instead, they would haul her out to the bay, to the harbor, give her a camo job, throw some guns on her, and call her a guard ship. So she was reclassed that June as a, guard ship in Sasebo Bay. This would last until August, when her guns would be pulled off to take other places, because the war is, ending. They know that. Still yet, they're doing what they can. And then she would be surrendered to the Allies on September 2nd, when, the war was officially ended. A U.S. team would take a look at Junyo that October, and they classed her as a just complete write-off. She had so much damage. She wasn't the best built in the beginning. She'd been through battle. She was just not usable for anything, so she was scrapped in the following year. So she did survive the war, although with a number of holes in her. Still, doing better than most of her sister carriers, that's for sure. And not bad for something that started off not even supposed to be a military ship. However, we do have one more ship that actually survived the war, surprisingly. We end where we began. Hosho. Laid down in 1920 and first in service as early as 1923, she would survive the war, surprisingly. Of course, she was used as a secondary reserve ship early on and a training ship later on. Like I said at the beginning, they did flirt with the idea of trying to get her to use newer aircraft in 1944, even giving her a refit, but this actually made her even less stable, so wasn't really good for it. So she mostly hung out in the harbor, again serving as a training ship early on, and then when his fuel was too low, too valuable, not even that really, she had a captain and crew, but that's about it. In March, she was hit in an air raid and damaged, but she was there, could easily be repaired. In April of 1945, they did flirt with the idea of putting her into service. After all, she's one of the tiny number of carriers they have. But this was very quickly rescinded, and actually her crew was transferred off. In June, her crew was transferred back on because they didn't know what to do, and she was classed as a guard ship, and kind of similar to Junyo. And she would still stay in the harbor. In July, she was yet again damaged during an air raid and would yet again be repaired. That's pretty much it. She was there during the surrender in September, but she would have a post-war mission of some note and quite honorable. She was used to transport Japanese citizens and others home. She would make 9 trips. In fact, in December of 1945, she would have some modifications made to make her better suited as a transport. and she would continue this mission into 1946, making her final run that August, so almost a year to the day after the war was over. 40,000 souls were taken back home thanks to Hosho. After this, she was handed over to the ministry and declared surplus, and probably a little bit sadly declared for scrapping, which would happen in 1947. I understand why Japan really didn't need warships after the war, but I don't know. Hosho was no threat to anyone, and pretty much all of her activities, save the events in China in the 1930s, were rather peaceful. But either way, after a quarter century of service, the first Japanese carrier became really the last Japanese carrier, at least until the 21st century when they get their next two. So there's a certain poetry to that, and she served with distinction. Not arranged in any particular order. Here we end the video. Very long video, but I wanted to do it, had fun doing it. Kind of outlining all the carriers. Most, anyway. Eagle Moss never did Ryujo. And like I said, they did do Zuikaku, but very small numbers. I never could find one. But everything else I have found over the years, which was a lot of fun to hunt them out. These are not expensive models. Typically $29, give or take. But a lot of fun, and they're big enough for detail. And I think it's important to talk about the Japanese aircraft, because America ended the war in the Pacific with its own aircraft, but Japan kind of started that notion. When America entered the war, they were still focused on battleships. And to be fair, Japan was too, with the Yamatos, but they had a more advanced view of aircraft carriers than America in 1941. And it does show. And it's interesting to see how they built a lot of these on cruiser hulls, even some almost with destroyer-type mentalities. They really valued speed and endurance over armor, although they did like to have a big flight group if they could. And it's worth pointing out that the biggest turning points in the most important battles in the Pacific were not battleship on battleship, but were carrier on carrier, really showing the importance of air power for the navies. Anyway, if you could, as always, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to help support the channel, please check out the link to the main Mishaco video that I did, where I talk about the guns, the rifles and pistols of the Japanese Navy. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.